All right, let's talk about how it is that gangs actually come to emerge, at least what we know about how they've emerged in the past. So, most people that have done research and been interested in studying gangs have been interested in studying them as they have arisen from high crime areas of extreme social disadvantage. If you think back to some of the theories about youth gangs that we've already talked about in this class, this shouldn't really be that surprising. That for the most part, people think of gangs as an inner city problem, and we'll talk about a little bit later whether or not this is changing. A criminologist named Moore in the late 1990s talked about four community conditions that, according to her, really need to be present in order for gangs to not only emerge but kind of flourish within a community. So, the first condition that she talked about was the presence, or really the absence, of socializing agents in terms of being effective at socializing and bringing up their youth to value kind of good, upstanding community activities. So you think about socializing agents, what that word means is, parents, teachers, older non-criminal peers, people that could have a positive pro-social influence on youth in the area who are essentially ineffective, not present, not able to do this, and may actually have the effect of alienating youth from wanting to emulate, wanting to do what they say. So that kind of an atmosphere, socializing agents that are ineffective and alienating, is really a key condition for her, from which gangs tend to arise. She also talks about teens within these communities having a lot of free time. Now, a lot of you, hopefully all of you, went to the majority of your high school classes all the time, and once high school was over every day, a lot of you probably had activities. Some of you had a sports team. Some of you played an instrument or had a part-time job. The point is, one thing that a lot of youth do, kind of a marker of adolescence and young adulthood, is, getting involved in some of these activities. Well, if you're in a youth that's in one of these communities, not only do not a lot of them actually spend the entire day at school, but once they're out of school, there's not a lot for them to do that's structured, that we would consider kind of pro-social. Essentially, in communities like this, teens have a lot of free time to just kind of hang out, drive around, and Moore talks about it kind of the same way that Hershey did, in terms of, idle hands being the devil's, doing the devil's work. If you don't give kids enough to do, they're going to get in trouble. She also talked about members of these communities having really limited access to legitimate jobs and career paths. So what she observes is happening is the desire for kind of a fast-paced, extravagant lifestyle that these young adolescents get shown on a daily basis isn't something that they have a lot of opportunity to emulate. They don't have a lot of money to get a lot of different pairs of sneakers, get a lot of different types of jeans, a lot of t-shirts, a lot of clothes, all these things that, when you're a young adolescent, are very important to you. So what they have to do is supplement their income, because traditional jobs are really not available. Or even if they are available, they don't become very appealing to teens from these communities. And the final condition that she talks about is the fact that groups in these communities really have to have a place to congregate. If they can find a place within the community to congregate where they're not going to get hassled very much by people like the police, parents, neighbors, they're going to be able to be successful. So when you think about The Wire, for example, think about The Pit, which is in the first season of The Wire in the housing project. It's where some of the main characters sit on a couch in the middle of it and kind of manipulate the drug activities going on around them. According to Moore, you really need a place like this to congregate, a place that not a lot of people in the community care about. And if you can have something like that in your community as a gang, you're going to be able to be fairly successful. Okay, so in terms of how gangs are structured, what I want you to do is think about and contrast what you're going to hear now with what we heard about in the organized crime lecture. So when we talked about organized crime last week, we talked about some of these organizations, especially kind of the Italian American syndicate crime groups, really having kind of a pyramid structure to them, having somebody at the top with advisors beneath them, and then layers going down with people doing less and less important tasks as part of the organization. It's really not the case that most street gangs have a structure like that. It's a very loosely structured, for the most part, organization in most cities. Usually there's one or two fairly high up people that kind of dictate what other people do, but membership in the gang doesn't necessarily give you a very specific role all the time. Obviously, gangs that are designed to be more lucrative are going to be a little bit more structured, but for the most part, your typical run of the mill street gang doesn't have, you know, captain, soldier, etc. Another kind of interesting thing about your typical uh, urban street gang is the fact that your average gang member doesn't really spend a very long time in a gang. So membership for your typical member is actually usually on average shorter than a year. That doesn't mean that they don't consider themselves gang affiliated, probably for a very long time in their life, but in terms of the amount of time your typical gang member is actually initiated, fully involved in the gang, it's usually a very short amount of time. And one thing that separates out street gangs from things like organized crime groups is the idea that what seems to be more important for a street gang is maintaining a code of loyalty, rather than having a very specific structured role within the organization. In other words, even though there are probably a couple kind of higher up members of your typical street gang, everyone underneath them is basically expected to do whatever is asked of them. And as long as you kind of maintain a code, as long as you know, respect and defend other people in the gang against rival gangs, against the police, etc., you're able to maintain your status in the gang. So it's not really the case that once you get initiated into a gang, you get a very specific role usually. Often it's more the case that the few higher up people in gangs have kind of a large pool of people to do any number of things for them. So when people first started to try to do research about gangs, and for the most part urban gangs, this really started in the 1950s. That's when media interest, anyway, in gangs got really high. And, they started to get portrayed, often really inaccurately, in things like Broadway shows and musicals. This is when there's a public outcry that, gangs are a problem, we need to do something about them. If you remember back to our discussion of subcultural theories of crime, some of those early social science researchers, people like Albert Cohen, Walter Miller, Cloward and Olin, all of those subcultural theories were describing young urban gang violence and crime. So even though they didn't necessarily think of themselves as gang specialists, by what they were doing, they really were, because what they were trying to do was explain why youth gangs and youth gang crime is rising and is such a problem. One of the interesting things about some of that early work, which you probably realized as we were learning about it, is, these initial authors, Cohen, Miller, Cloward, and Olin, they wrote about these theories. They wrote essays and books about them, and they had policy suggestions for the future that came out of them. But really, none of the people in that group actually very specifically tested their theory. What I mean by that is, these researchers didn't go out into gangs and conduct research to figure out if their ideas were right or not. I don't think that Albert Cohen ever went anywhere near a gang. He theorized about them and he thought about them, but this initial work was very theoretical, and we just didn't know for a long time if any of these, initial attempts at understanding gangs had any bearing on reality. So in the 1980s, interest in actually doing some scientific research on urban gangs there started to be a dramatic interest in this area of crime. And that's because of the amount of urban gang violence that erupted really in the late 1980s. So you guys have seen, official aggregate crime trends enough in this class to know that in the 1980s, the amount of violent and property crime in this country, after reaching a little bit of a lull towards the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s, saw incredibly high spikes. We call it now the youth violence epidemic, because from 1985 to 1993, the amount of youth handgun homicides increased by about 200%, and there was an incredibly close link between those homicides and gang-related activities. So this is the first time that criminologists and sociologists not only analyzed the crime data, but tried to actually get at okay, there's violent crime going on, but who's doing it and who's doing it to whom? And that's when people started to realize that a big problem that came out of the 1980s was the incredible rise in violent activity by youth gangs. So not only was the spike in violent crime, but the large increases in both violent and property crime were really getting attributed in the 1980s to gang related activities. And a big reason for this, a big reason why urban gangs were the ones that had the largest share in terms of increasing violent and property crime, is the fact that the 1980s was a time when crack cocaine got introduced into the market in urban centers. You can't really examine what was going on in gangs in the 1980s without understanding the growing and really ballooning crack market that was going on at the same time. So when you think about what we know at this point about crack cocaine and how it's differentiated maybe from things like powder cocaine. Think about how crack cocaine is actually produced and sold, and think about what about this might make it extremely appealing and lucrative for young urban street gangs. So crack is something that's easily buffed and stretched by lacing it with multiple other substances. So gangs in the 1980s could purchase pretty low quality um, cocaine bases and sell for higher profits. It's also a type of cocaine that's typically sold one hit at a time. You've probably seen this enough on the wire to realize that what they're selling on the street to individual customers isn't large quantities of cocaine, it's individual hits. And one of the benefits of that is it makes it really easy for low level members of street gangs to kind of manipulate and deal with the quantities because all they're selling is small amounts of it. So, just to give you an example of what was going on here, because of this explosion in the market, you had all of a sudden, you had a ton of different small time, essentially, urban gangs trying to get their feet into this market, trying to get their hands on a supply of customers to turn a profit with crack cocaine and heroin and a number of other a number of other illegal substances. And what happened in the late 1980s is a lot of the skirmishes that happened between gangs vying for turf in urban areas resulted in homicide and violence more than they ever had before. To give you an example, in Chicago from the late 80s to the early 90s, there was a 500% increase in gang related homicide. So this wasn't just a little phenomenon. This was something that incredibly captured urban areas. And it also coincided with the fact that firearms during the 1990s were all of a sudden becoming much more available. Firearms became more advanced. So in the early 1980s, that's when semi-automatic weapons, instead of pistols, were all of a sudden cheap and easy for people to obtain. All of these things kind of culminated in the late 1980s, and gangs were really at the center of it.